Welcome to Full PreFrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive functions. This show is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. These conversations will introduce mental tools that will empower you to shift your mindset for a successful life. And now, here's your host, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome back to Full PreFrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive functions. I am here with our host, Sucheta Kamath. Good morning, Sucheta. Looking forward to this. You're going to tell us a story about Haruki Murakami. Let's get to it.
Thank you, Todd. Executive functions are a particular set of skills that help negotiate the demands of childhood, but they're not limited to childhood needs. Eventually, these skills help adults manage their own executive functions as either students or employees, entrepreneurs, or even parents. And if you think largely as members of large society. As we strive to live a fully engaged, completely filled to the brim, responsible, multifaceted life, it is our executive functions that come to the rescue and help make everyday transitions seamless. When executive functions work well, they facilitate discipline of persistence and hard work. If not, the glitches vary from many hiccups in living a successful life to utter disaster, which causes an epic failure to launch. I want to share with you a story of Haruki Murakami, who is a renowned and celebrated Japanese author who never dreamed of being a writer. He started working at a record store and eventually opened a coffee house and a jazz bar at age 25. The legend has it, apparently at 29, while watching a baseball game in a Jingu Stadium in Japan, he was suddenly inspired to write a novel. By then, working at jazz club late into nights, Murakami had developed a habit of chain smoking and a truly sedentary life. As he committed to writing, he decided to make a drastic change in his lifestyle. So from hustle bustle of urban life in Tokyo, Murakami moved to the countryside, quit smoking, changed his diet to eating more vegetables and fish, and took up running. His habit of running daily blossomed into the love for the sport. Quarter century later, he has run almost 27 marathons and 1 triathlon. When asked about writing, Murakami says it certainly is more than mental discipline. Physical strength is necessary as artistic sensitivity, he says. He contests that there is nothing called pure talent. Through his journey, he has identified 2 things, immense focus and deep endurance. And they are nothing but executive functions, as you can see. So Murakami believes that these can be acquired and sharpened through training. Murakami transitioned from not having a specific passion or direction to more intentional life of a writer. Concerns about whether he's a good writer or not did not stop him from pursuing writing. Finally, he sharpened and cultivated 2 fundamental executive skills, one of immense focus and second of deep endurance, by training himself. So that brings me to our today's guest. Today, Dr. Dawson will be joining us for a deep and meaningful conversation about these very essential skills that act as a building block of executive functions. She's an outstanding school psychologist who, through her work, has had a national impact on the field. Dr. Dawson has worked at the Center for Learning and Attention Disorder in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, for over 25 years, where she specializes in assessment of children and adults with learning and attentional disorders. Dr. Dawson is most known for her Amazon bestseller, Smart But Scattered, which she co-authored with her colleague, Dr. Richard Gere, a book every parent and educator should read, in my opinion. Their new book, Smart But Scattered, A Guide to Success, has been just recently released, and I, again, recommend everybody to read that. Dr. Dawson is a past president of both National Association of School Psychologists and the International School Psychology Association. Dr. Dawson is a 2010 recipient of the International School Psychology Association Distinguished Service Award, and she also has received 2006 Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Association of School Psychologists. Finally, Dr. Dawson has a personal connection to the topic of emerging executive functional challenges, and she often mentions that in her talks. That is, 2 of her own children who struggled with these issues when they were growing up, and how successfully they have circumvented it. So Now, there you go, Todd. We have a really prolific speaker and author who's going to be a guest with us today.
Oh, no kidding. And training for a marathon myself, your story about Haruki Murakami really spoke to me. But you're right. This conversation with Peggy Dawson promises to be a very important episode. Very much looking forward to it. So let's get to it. Here is Sucheta's conversation with Dr. Peg Dawson.
Welcome to the show, Peg. I am such a big fan of your work, and your book, Smart But Scattered, has transformed many of my family's lives. So I thank you for that. Please tell our listeners a little bit about you.
Yeah, sure. My background is school psychology. I got a doctorate in school in child clinical psychology from the University of Virginia a long time ago. Worked in the public schools for about 16 years, and then joined my colleague and ultimately my co-author, a guy named Dr. Guare. We had a private practice for a while, and then we merged with a local community mental health center. And around the time I switched out of the public schools, I became particularly interested in children with attention disorders. And that led me to executive skills, which ultimately led to my writing. Dr. Guare and I have written books for both parents and professionals on the topic. And I think that's how you got to me, was through Smart But Scattered.
Exactly. And I really want it to have a wider reach. And mainly, I want you to kind of simplify to our audience regarding the complex matter of executive functions and its lifelong impact. So let's make it started with, how would you define executive functions for a layman?
Okay. So executive skills or executive functions are brain-based skills. They're managed out of the frontal lobes of the brain. They're basically the underlying foundational skills that everybody needs in order to execute tasks. So that's where the name came from. You use them to execute tasks. And they're things like planning and organization and time management and task initiation and sustained attention. But as I say, the connector between them all is they're the skills we need in order to get things done.
Got it. And also, I think the part of that, how it connects to the self and how you get things done for self and how it impacts your future outcome for self. So do you see that having an important connection, not some just ability to do something, but something towards your own gains, correct?
Yeah. Are you talking about more being able to achieve long-term goals or?
Yeah, long-term goals as well as, so it's, as you and I know, that students in the classroom are able to answer questions. But when it comes to actually producing something in writing or doing the homework, or if they love Spanish, they're doing a lot of it, but they hate math, they're not doing anything at all. So it's not their pure ability to do or not execute, but it's their ability to execute even when they have no specific interest in it.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And that's when they really come into play, because things like task initiation or sustained attention, for instance, which are two critical executive skills, you don't need to call on those if you're playing video games and that's something you enjoy doing. So it's absolutely in the context of tasks that are not on your preferred list where you really need
exactly. So
Yep.
And in your book, you talk a lot about that. How do you get kids? Because it's quite puzzling to an observer if you see a child deeply engaged in a video game for 4 hours, but doesn't have time to spare to do a project for 20 minutes. And that disparity is really hard to reconcile for an observer. So you described that these are very essential skills to negotiate the demands of childhood. So can you kind of help us understand that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, basically, we've identified, and every neuroscientist or neuropsychologist has sort of a different collection of executive skills with lots of different definitions and categories. But what my colleague and I did was we identified 11 skills that we thought were absolutely critical to school success. They start developing shortly after birth, but they take 25 years at least to reach full maturation. So no kid graduates from high school with a fully functioning set of executive skills. Some of them are more foundational or more elemental, maybe, and earlier developing than the later skills, things like task initiation or response inhibition, which is the ability to control your impulses, working memory, the ability to hold on to information when you need it, like solving a math problem in your head or something like that. Those all come online pretty early. They may mature at different rates. So response inhibition, for instance, in teenagers is notoriously underdeveloped. And that's what leads teenagers to make a lot of rash decisions and sometimes make mistakes. But they mature across childhood, both because the brain matures, but also because parents and teachers put them in situations where they have to use the skills. And so the role of parents and teachers is to provide tasks that require those executive skills at a level that the child is able to manage them. So we might give a 5-year-old a 3-minute chore to do. Whereas, by the time they're 11 or 12, we might be asking them to do a 30-minute chore. And that would be like sustained attention and task initiation.
So you're describing many key components of executive functions, including response inhibition, task management, kind of goal-directed behaviors. Tell us some more executive functions that are essential for formal years of learning that kind of have its way of presenting differently in the classroom versus at home.
Oh, sure. Yeah, and you're right. These skills do look different in the classroom than at home, often in elementary school because classrooms are structured. And so when a teacher is handing out work and asking kids to get started, it's often easier for them to do work in the classroom than at home where, no parent runs their home the way a classroom is run with, a set schedule and tasks identified to begin at a certain time. So things like planning or organization, teachers sort of meet those out or parcel those out at a level that kids are ready for. For parents, it's often trickier because they don't necessarily have a clear grasp of, well, when is my child ready to plan his way through a room cleaning or even organize how his room is going to be cleaned. And so parents are, and that's why we wrote Smart but Scattered, was because we thought that parents might like a guidebook to help them understand what's developmentally appropriate and how do you build in a routine that gets kids through their day, or routines, I should say, like getting ready for school in the morning or picking up their bedroom or doing chores or writing papers. So they're both school-related tasks as well as home-related tasks.
So I see them quite interestingly the way you explain it, that they creep up on you. So the parents who have children with executive function problems begin to notice that their own kids are falling out of step with other kids. And there's that nagging voice that says, something is off, or is this right? Should this be a skill, or is this a right way to struggle? But you are describing they're so insidious. They're so slowly creeping into your life that before you know, maybe by 7th grade, it becomes a full-blown problem. So how do parents understand to deal with this complex marriage between gradual development of a prefrontal system as well as gradually increased demand on complex self-management?
Well, I think a lot of parents do this just naturally. So, for instance, no parent of a preschooler would say to them, can you pick up your bedroom sometime today, assuming that they're going to initiate that task of their own volition. No, when it's time to pick up the bedroom, the parents say, okay, let's clean the bedroom. And in the early stages, not only do they decide when it's time to clean the bedroom, but parents are right there side by side helping their child do that. And then as the children get older and are able to take on more of that themselves, parents drop away. So they don't necessarily have to be in the bedroom. Or they might say to them, okay, I want you to put all your dirty clothes in the laundry and then I'll check in and see how you're doing. So they gradually pull themselves back. But you're right. If kids are out of sync in terms of their executive skill development, parents may not know that. Sometimes they realize it because teachers start talking and saying, your child's having or remembering to hand in their homework or getting through their seat work on time. And sometimes when their kids, have friends over or have birthday parties or things like that, then parents can start looking at their children compared to their peers and notice that something might not be quite right. Particularly around I haven't talked about this executive skill, but there's another executive skill called emotional control and another one called flexibility, which means your ability to manage your emotions and your ability to adjust to changes in plans or to disappointment, those kinds of things.
Can you give us an example of both?
Yeah. So a child who has his heart set on doing something, and maybe even a parent has said, as soon as I get this work done, then we get to go for ice cream. And then something comes up that's out of the parent's control and they have to change the plans. Well, kids who have trouble with flexibility have a really hard time dealing with those changes in plans. But mommy, you promised, might be a response. And they often have trouble managing their emotions. So they may have meltdowns or tantrums associated with either those changes in plans or things not going the way they wanted to, or even a sibling taking away a toy they wanted to play with. So those are ones where actually parents often recognize those executive skill challenges at an earlier age because they find that those disrupt family functioning. If a child throws a tantrum that lasts for 20 minutes and they do that a lot, then parents want to try to deal with that. So that may show itself earlier than, say, problems with planning.
So, Peggy, before we came about using the term executive function, we would have typically called such kids behaviorally problematic. And we would just even have two thoughts. Maybe one is the parents are not managing them well. That means they don't have good behavior management plan for them, how they raise their children, or the children are not really listening to the parents. But it was very behaviorally driven. How do we get people to understand that the cognitive nature of executive functions? Can you comment or give our listeners a framework of the underpinning neuropsychological skills that are cognitive in nature that go into executive function management?
Well, there's certainly an overlap, but I do think by labeling the executive skills more specifically, it helps direct parents to strategies that might be effective. So, you can call a child willful, but that doesn't help you deal with, this child has trouble managing his emotions. So let's give him some strategies for managing his emotions. Or kids who are impulsive. Some kids are naturally more impulsive than others, but if we understand that there may be strategies for helping kids stop and think before they say or do something, or ways we can, if they truly are impulsive, ways we can structure their lives so their impulsivity doesn't get them in trouble or lead to danger. So a very impulsive child may need to be reminded before they get out of a car in a parking lot, past the age where other kids do, remember to watch for cars, or I'm going to have to hold your hand to make sure you don't run out.
I like what you're saying, because by labeling it, you're even bringing out the concreteness of this is a skill that has not emerged versus this is a skill that exists, but child is failing to exercise. And that can really shift the way we treat others, right? Treat children or treat adults with executive function problems.
Yeah, exactly. We tend to see all of these as skill deficits as opposed to things that the child is choosing not to do, or or even, again, going back to the parents, rather than blaming the parents, we may say to them, this is something your child hasn't learned yet. So let's see if we can figure out how to teach them.
Beautiful. So can you now talk a little bit about parents' own executive functions and this kind of a song and dance that goes between parents managing executive functions of children with their own executive functions?
Sure. When we wrote Smart But Scattered, and actually this came after years of working with both kids and adults around executive skills, but we realized that the more parents understood about their own executive skills profile, that might help them either understand their kids or get a better understanding of the tension points in their relationship with their kids. Very often kids have very similar profiles to parents, but sometimes they have very different profiles. And so the chapter we wrote in Smart But Scattered, where parents can assess their own executive skills, I don't know how many parents I've talked to who said that's my favorite chapter in the whole book.
Mine too.
They learn so much about themselves. And I just find that so helpful. If a parent is highly organized and they have a disorganized child, in fact, I say this to adults all the time. If you are naturally good at any particular executive skill, it's probably really hard for you to understand people who are naturally bad at those skills. And so a highly organized parent with a disorganized kid, that is often a source of conflict, because to a parent, organization comes very easily, does not come easily to that child. And so they really need to step back and say, okay, this is my strength, but it's my child's weakness. So how can I both help him to get more organized, and how can I learn to tolerate my kid's disorganization while he's learning that skill?
And as a true psychologist at heart, I like the way you bring people's attention to that. The idea about all this is to negotiate that space within which two parties are operating, and managing these ever so moving executive demands requires a constant adjustment, mental flexibility, adaptive thinking. And so if you're dealing with somebody who has deficit in that, and if you react to it with a deficit model, then it's going to be a disaster. So it's a good idea to think about giving a lot of kind of a introspective thought to your own executive process. How do you present this to educators and their own executive functions when they're dealing with many students in a classroom and who are not their children?
Sure. Well, interestingly enough, I use the same approach. I start by having them identify their own executive skill strengths and weaknesses to help them understand. And I've recently gone a step further when I do workshops with teachers, because after they fill out their executive skills questionnaire, I then ask them to think about, where did you get those skills? How do people acquire skills? Are we born with them? And I give them 4 options. Do they just emerge naturally the way vision does in kids, or are they learned through practice, the way kids learn how to walk? Are they learned through modeling and shaping, the way kids learn language? Or are they explicitly taught them? And then I have them vote. And it's always interesting to see. Most teachers recognize that the 2 biggest influences on the development of executive skills are practice and modeling and shaping. And then I can say, okay, so if you've got kids in your classroom who are not particularly good, that means they need more practice and they may need more modeling and shaping from you.
Beautiful. And I really think this is a great way to break it down, because I absolutely, in my interactions, in my presentations and my work, I experienced that many have preconceived notion about this natural ability, which takes its own course of development, which is, it emerges, it comes on board. And when it comes on, it is at its best. And that is not how executive functions work.
Yeah, exactly.
See why this has become such an important process to address, or a set of skills that we need to talk about collectively as a culture, as an institution, as a system, because in 21st century. How do you see our, last 100 years, how we have changed as a working people who are functioning in this universe, and why have they become so important?
Well, I think for a couple of reasons, primarily because life has gotten more complicated. I mean, technology has expanded our capacity for doing all kinds of amazing things, but it also means that we're stretching ourselves cognitively, especially when kids are required to use technology for academic pursuits. On the other hand, the double-edged sword of technology is that it's also become incredibly seductive to kids. So at a time when they are not particularly good at impulse control or resisting temptation, there are so many fun things out there that kids can and want to be doing that compete with, doing schoolwork. And so that's one. I think parents lead more complicated lives now, so that they may be less available to be patient and walk their kids through executive skill development. And so those 2 things in particular, I think, have an impact. And then, when we look at how schools have changed, when I was growing up, I could pretty much get through school just by memorizing stuff. And I had to learn a few skills like how to put together a coherent paragraph or something. But nowadays, so much of what we're asking kids to do for homework or even in schoolwork is much more sophisticated and complex. And you can't memorize your way to a high school diploma anymore. And so that demands that you use things like planning and organization and time management and what we call metacognition, which is sort of the last executive skill to develop, which is really the ability to put all the pieces together and to see the big picture. And so, do you have other thoughts about things that impact?
I think you make these beautiful points. I think the last point I might add is, I think our expectation has changed regarding what means to be proficient, and multitasking, which is, you and I know, is a myth, is become a cultural expectation without any thought given to what it means to multitask or what cognitive abilities, behavioral abilities go into it. So I think there's a culture has gotten blindsided by its own grand sense of self.
Yeah, I'd agree with that too.
What a fabulous conversation. Thank you so much for your time. And before I let you go, if people want to reach you or find out more about your work, where can they find you?
Probably the easiest way is to visit my website, which is smartbutscatteredkids.com. So smartbutscatteredkids, all one word, .com. And there are numerous resources on there, but there's also a place for contact me. And that's probably the best way to reach me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being a guest on our show. And I really appreciate your time.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
All right, so that was Dr. Peg Dawson. What an intriguing conversation, Sucheta. As a psychologist who has worked in schools, Dr. Dawson has a very comprehensive take of the nature of executive functions. What do you think about that?
She certainly does. I really enjoyed, first of all, conversing with her, and her wisdom is definitely going to benefit all our listeners. I like the way she describes executive functions. Her take is that there are 11 set of executive skills that go into managing oneself. And she didn't go through each and every one of them, but just for the listeners' benefit, I thought I will summarize them. They are response inhibition, working memory, emotional control, sustained attention, task initiation, planning and organization, time management, goal-directed persistence, flexibility, and metacognition. She also talks about stress tolerance as one of the skills that has also an additional impact on executive functions. So when you use this kind of a comprehensive framework, as you can imagine, if any of these components are problematic for a child, that can lead to having a direct impact on educational achievement.
Well, reflecting on the conversation with Dr. Dawson, there were a lot of really critical takeaways. Lead us off with some that you think are relevant for us to be thinking about.
Sure, Todd. The first, I think that all of us need to keep in mind that executive functions refer to your capacity to execute a goal that you have in mind. These skills, as I listed earlier, are a collection of many, many underlying skills. They're slow to emerge. They take a long time to master. Some of them are more elemental, while the others are more interdependent and complex. And finally, in absence of some of these skills, it creates a tension between a person who is performing effectively or is trying to achieve these skills that are not mastered yet can create a lot of roadblocks. I agree with Peg that we should use more of a skill deficit model when we talk about executive functions versus a child not using to use the skills that he does have. This can help us understand more effectively and more compassionately the struggles that are going through the child's mind as well as in his learning experience. I also like the point that she's making that each and every skill that when it's absent leads to certain symptoms or behaviors, and they need to be labeled properly. Labeling can have a great positive impact, and it can have benefit for the educators, parents, but most importantly, this labeling using executive function framework can help the child.
Well, addressing executive functions, understanding executive functions, it really seems to be now what I would consider an urgent calling in the 21st century, yeah?
Operating in 21st century is certainly a much more complex matter. The way my discussion with her got into these details, I feel our listeners need to understand this takeaway where we are living in a hyperconnected and technocentric world. And this has created a situation where emergent brain, which to begin with lacks the executive control, are expected to exercise impulse control, which is slow to be mastered. This requires the child, a young developing mind, to resist temptations. And when you have such kind of a direct access, it can create a great challenge in navigating the goals that you're trying to accomplish. The second part of the 21st century living is parents lead more complicated lives, as Peg pointed out. They are juggling themselves multiple sets of demands on their executive functions. And on top of that, they're required to manage their children's lives independently without much support from so-called the village. Every family is operating as an independent, individualistic unit, and they are trying to navigate all these responsibilities. The third point that she was making in this takeaway that schools have changed the way they teach and educate. There's a more focus on collaborative, project-centered, and beyond memorization kind of learning. And there's no specific teaching or explicit instructions about how to do that. And that's created a 21st century challenge. And I would say, finally, the families have less time to learn to work with each other as a collective unit. And as collective group of challenges is posing a problem for this emergent brain to show mastery.
Well, what I found very intriguing about your conversation with Dr. Dawson was she discussed, and she has a really nice way of making both parents and educators very aware of their own executive functions, their strengths and weaknesses. And that's very much connected to their own understanding of the support needed for their children. Yes?
Yeah, that was so true, Todd. her work and her collaboration emphasizes a lot on parents as well as educators doing executive function self-assessment. And these checklists kind of are designed to give them a little bit of an insight into themselves. So once as she was talking about, once adults take this inventory for themselves, then Peg proceeds to ask them that where did you learn these skills? And do you even recall? And generally, she wants our listeners to be aware that there are 4 categories of patterns of learning. The first one is a naturally emerging skill, like vision. That means you open your eyes and vision comes on. You don't have any progressive improvement in vision. That means your vision doesn't get better with time or with age. The second type of learning development is learning through practice, doing something over and over again. Jump roping, for example, you get better and better and more skilled as you practice. Or take an example of using a spoon or a fork and a knife together. The third set of emergent learning is through modeling or shaping behaviors. That feedback is given and you tweak and you adjust and you kind of develop that ability. And finally, a skill that is taught explicitly. So take piano, for example. You have to be taught which finger needs to be placed where to get the maximum impact of maneuvering all the fingers and all the keys. And what she points out to adults, including parents and teachers, that some of these skills need to be explicitly taught. They're not going to emerge like vision. And if you carry that preconceived notion, then you are going to create a certain type of mindset, and that will be a sort of resistance to noticing the challenges that a child has with executive functions. So I love this perspective because it really is inviting everybody to think that, am I expecting executive functions to be turned on just the way I turn on my vision by opening my eyes? And if not, then what options do I have to help them emerge? It was a terrific way that I think she kind of broke things down for us. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I agree with you. Very profound. And again, a great conversation with Dr. Peg Dawson. So that's all the time we have for today. On behalf of our host, Sucheta Kamath, and all of us at Cerebral Matters, thank you for tuning in today, and we look forward to seeing you next week on Full PreFrontal.
Thank you for listening to Full PreFrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive functions. To contact our host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive functions, visit her website at cerebralmatters.com. That's cerebralmatters.com. Tune in next week for the next informative episode of Full PreFrontal.